you very much. Hello. The Second Punic War is a significant war. It's worth studying, not just because it's an interesting war, quite a long war, a tactically interesting war, but it's also a historically significant war because for the ancient world it was a bit like World War Naught. The ancients were of course aware that there was India and China, and if you crossed the desert eventually there were people who lived beyond the Sahara, but really the Mediterranean was their world. So to the east, their thoughts of people who lived in the east, they were the Persians and people like that. And then you had Spain, which was the western boundary of the world, and Britain was too north. They weren't too far north. They weren't interested in that. So it was a war that involved the whole world. There was fighting in Greece. There was fighting in North Africa. There was another fight going on for who was going to end up ruling the Numidians. Eventually, a chap called Massinissa ended up triumphant there, but there were plenty of contenders. There was loads of fighting in Spain, there was fighting across southern Gaul, there was fighting all around Italy, there was fighting in Greece, and to a lesser extent a little bit later on further east, and there was fighting on all the islands. This is when Malta first became Roman. The Punic Wars changed who was in control of Corsica and Sardinia, and there was a huge amount of fighting, which I won't be going into in much detail here, in Sicily. But just in case you need to place this in your minds geographically and in time, this is where Archimedes is doing all his work with Syracuse, with the huge engines that are picking up boats and dropping them again back into the water and all that sort of stuff. But I'm not going to be concentrating on that because I'm going to be concentrating on what Hannibal was doing, and Hannibal wasn't fighting in Sicily. He wasn't fighting much apart from at the very start in Spain either. He left that to mainly to his brother Hasdrubal. But it was a very, very significant war, not just because of the scale, the number of people involved, but also because the stakes were very high. We think now of Rome as this huge empire, but Rome wasn't a huge empire once. It had to start somewhere, and Rome itself was a tiny little insignificant village once. It was believed in the ancient world that Alexander the Great had never heard of Rome. It was just some upstart village somewhere, who cares about that? But he'd heard of Carthage, because Carthage, even in his time, was a really powerful nation. And when Alexander the Great, who conquered Greece, because he wasn't Greek, he was Macedonian, he conquered Greece, and in his conquering he went into North Africa, he conquered Egypt. Didn't go as far as west as Carthage, and the Carthaginians of the time would have you believe this is because they were too mighty. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. They would have put up a hell of a stiff resistance if he'd gone that far west with an army across North Africa. Supply would have been a big problem because he'd have a big desert behind him, and it's very difficult to ship anything in because the Carthaginian navy was so powerful, and they could have sent a huge force behind him, cut off supply lines. He would have been probably in a world of trouble if he tried to take on the Carthaginians, and he didn't. So that's probably because they were so mighty. But then again, he could always say, oh, well, I wanted to go to India. So Rome was the upstart, and Carthage was, before the Punic Wars, the main power in the region, and could have continued to be so, perhaps. In which case, if you got a degree in whatever the University of... Does Pennsylvania have you must have. Yeah, at the University of Pennsylvania, and it'll probably say somewhere on your certificate something in Latin, and that's because this war wasn't won by the Carthaginians. But perhaps if the Carthaginians had been triumphant, today when you get your degree, or when you listen to a Catholic mass or whatever, it would be in Punic. It's not inevitable that the Romans would rise to the prominence and that Latin would become such a significant language. So the stakes were very high. There were 3 Punic Wars. Punic War number 1, which I won't talk about much, was perhaps an embarrassing defeat for the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians were this extremely powerful naval force, and they had a powerful and comparatively experienced navy, and my goodness, didn't the Romans do well at learning how to fight at sea. They learned how to build these ships. They built fleets, plural, and somehow managed to beat the Carthaginians eventually at their own game. Of course, there was land warfare involved as well, but it's pretty amazing that the Romans were able to put their military machine, their economic machine, into gear at such a rate that they're able to build these fleets and actually defeat the Carthaginians. And at the end of that, they are getting the Carthaginians to sign treaties, limiting the power of their fleets, limiting their territorial holdings and ambitions, paying reparations, and those sort of things. It was quite a civilized ending to a war. Then we have the Second Punic War, which is Hannibal's, and eventually, sorry, spoiler alert here, Hannibal lost, or the Carthaginians lost, depending on how you look at it. And obviously I'll be coming back to that. But to skip forward to Punic War number 3, Punic War number 3 was not of great interest to is not of great interest to wargamers today, because it was short, sharp, and very one-sided, and the Carthaginians were very thoroughly defeated, and Carthage itself was smashed up. Loads of the population were enslaved or murdered, and the earth was ritually salted. Some people think, is it true that they really just salted the whole of the Carthaginian agricultural lands to make them infertile? No, it was just a ritual thing. You sort of march around the outside with a few priests scattering just a line of salt around it. But even so, they were very thorough. They didn't want a Punic War number 4, and the Romans didn't get a Punic War number 4. That was the end for Carthage. Now, as for the Second Punic War, actually, talk about Hannibal. Now, some people will describe Hannibal as an African, some as a Carthaginian, some as a Phoenician, some as one of the Barcids, which is a particular family of Carthaginians. Some would say, oh, he was a soldier, or he was a general, or he was a mercenary, or he was an adventurer. And all these things are true, and yet sort of not true. Yes, you could say he was from Carthage, and therefore he was African, because Carthage is on the north coast of Africa. But actually, he spent very little of his life in Carthage. He was on campaign from the ages of 9 to 45. And after that, he spent a while in Carthage, even actually running Carthage for a while, but then he went out east, which is where he eventually died. So he was primarily someone not spending his time in Africa, and you could say he was Carthaginian. But then who were the Carthaginians? They were originally a Phoenician colony. Phoenicia is, there's no one spot you can say that is Phoenicia with a line around it like a modern border, but they were from, broadly speaking, the eastern Mediterranean, places like Lebanon and Syria today. And but they planted that colony on North Africa a long time before, and it had become very, very powerful, and they sailed all around the Mediterranean. So there would have been people from all around the Mediterranean, and other peoples perhaps somewhat north from Africa. So it was a bit of a melting pot. So to say that you're Carthaginian it doesn't really mean a huge amount. It doesn't tell us, for a start, how Phoenician he was. The Barcids were extremely wealthy. They were wealthy on a scale that's almost beyond modern imagining. Bill Gates is pretty well off. I think we can all agree on that. But the idea of Bill Gates privately funding a war with Russia is, you giggle at that as an idea, but that is sort of what the Barcids did. They were incredibly rich. They had silver mines in Spain, and they mined those for all they were worth, and they were pretty good at conquering people. And you can always pay mercenaries not just with coins up in advance, but with the promise of loot. And so as long as you keep being successful, that's one way of paying for an army. And you could say that the entire Second Punic War was actually an adventure by the Barcid family. There was the Lion's Brood. Now, the lion himself was Hannibal's father, that's Hamilcar, who was a very successful general in the First Punic War, and he was never defeated. He spent most of his time fighting in Sicily, never got the support from Carthage that he felt he deserved, and was ordered back to Carthage at the end of the war, and he felt that I was doing really well there, and you've ruined everything. I could have had them, but all right, I'll come back. And they had other uses for him. There was actually a mercenaries revolt later on, because the mercenaries, including some of his own mercenaries, didn't get paid, and so he had to sort that out. And so he had a bitterness towards his own regime, if you like. Carthage had a senate, just like Rome had a senate. But that doesn't mean that Carthage was ordering the Barcids to do everything that the Barcids were doing. In fact, much of the Carthaginian Senate for much of the war was against what the Barcids were doing. But they had their power base in Spain, and they had allied themselves with quite a few of the Celtic and Spanish and Celtiberian tribes there. Celtiberian is a bit of an archaeologist's cheat term. There are native Celtic-looking things that get dug up and Spanish-looking things, and there are cultures where the two seem to be melded together, but we're not entirely sure where the borders lie. So Celtiberian's nice catch-all. It's a nice little catch-all term for that lot. And one of the ways that they were able to get power is that because these tribes are warring against each other, if you say to this tribe, well, we'll help you against that tribe, what do you say? You don't have to pay them then. In fact, they may even pay you for the help. So you're able to build up a power base, but it turned out later to be not brilliantly loyal, and a lot of the Celtiberian tribes swapped sides during the war, some of them more than once. But anyway, they have this power base in Spain, and it's from there that they launched the war. And it's the Barkids who broke the treaty by besieging, well, a bit of a moot point, but the Romans would say they broke the treaty by besieging Saguntum, which was a spectacularly, you go and see it today, it's a very, very steep hill with a fort on the top of it, and that proved a very tough nut to crack. Eventually, Hannibal did take Saguntum, but it took him absolutely ages, which didn't augur well for his ability to take anything by siege or by storm later on. And indeed, in Italy, he either never tried or had very little success with sieges and taking fortified places by storm. And they crossed north. They went north, and they got they crossed the Ebro River, which was by treaty the northern limit of Carthaginian interests. And they kept going, and they went and Hannibal took an army over the Pyrenees, which is a substantial the mountains between Spain and France, and according to Livy and other historians, started marching across Gaul. And it's at this point that his men, a lot of them, twigged, hang on, we're not actually just sorting out the local tribes in northern Spain, which is what I thought we were doing. You seem to be, why are we marching across Gaul? You're not going to invade Italy, are you? Seriously, that's a hell of a long way away, and there's the Alps, and the Romans are pretty good, and 3,000 of them deserted, and Hannibal brought his army to a halt and sent home another 7,000 men that he thought were a little bit dodgy. He'd rather not have them, assuming that he was probably going to lose them anyway. He'd rather not have them about, didn't want them sowing dissent. So he's losing men, and this tells us as well about how little the men knew under him what his plans were. One of the advantage of having an army commanded by one guy is that if anyone gets captured and tortured by the enemy, they won't be able to say a thing, because you've got just one guy who knows what's going on at the top. And it seems that he hadn't told even his own army that he was going to invade Italy. He had to fight his way across Gaul, fighting quite a fairly major action and crossing the Rhone. He then had to get across the Alps, which is the big thing. And when I talk to people about my graphic novel and Hannibal, they know elephants, Alps are the two things that everyone knows about. And elephants, really minor part in this war. He got across the Alps with all of 37 elephants, and by the time the Battle of Trasimene came around, he was down to 1. And almost all of them died of cold. They're not brilliantly well adapted. They're adapted for the hot weather in North Africa, and incidentally, his elephants were not the African elephants that we know today. They were substantially smaller. They're possibly, we reckon that they were actually smaller than Indian elephants are today. But still, if what you've got a horse is really big. But militarily, the elephants really were not a significant factor in the war. But they became a bit of a Carthaginian symbol. They put them on coins and so forth, because we've got elephants and you haven't. So a minor terror weapon, really. But anyway, crossing the Alps, which he did later in the year than he intended, he lost a huge number of men, and it was a bedraggled 37,000 men, 90,000 having started in northern Spain, at least 90,000, possibly, depending on some sources, as many as 102,000. A bedraggled force limped out of the Alps down into northern Italy, which is what is known in this period as Cisalpine Gaul. People think of Italy as an obvious geographical unity, because that's what it is today, bordered by the Alps on top. But of course, in northern Italy at this point, there were Gauls living there. They were not under Roman sway, and in fact, they'd been fighting a bitter war against the Romans only shortly before that. So it was good for Hannibal because he was able in advance, he sent diplomats ahead of him, so he got welcomed. Thank goodness, because if they'd attacked him, his men were in a terrible state and needed a lot of food and rest to get themselves physically back together after the grueling, freezing cold trip over the Alps. So he then was able to ally a load of these Gauls in northern Italy to fight the Romans. So he was able to boost his numbers with a load of keen warriors, not necessarily the best warriors, but a load of keen warriors who seemed to be happy to be led by him. He had quite a bit of a reputation already. Yes, that's one of the main points I want to get across, is the idea that you can look upon this as a private adventure by a family, rather than a war that has been ordered by Carthage and therefore might expect to be supported by Carthage. So he has to pick up these mercenaries as he goes along. Yes, there was a small core of his army, if you like, that were Libyan spearmen, citizens of actual Carthage who'd come from the actual city of Carthage, but it was a tiny proportion of the Carthaginian army was actually Carthaginian. And they were all mercenaries, so they have to be either paid or they have to really definitely expect loot. And by this point, they've walked all the way up Spain, across France, and they're into Italy across the Alps. So even if they were to turn back now, it might be 2 years before they'd see their wives again. So I imagine that a lot of these men, realizing they're in for the full ride, they sort of knew that they perhaps weren't going to see their wives and families again, and maybe they were thinking already of, I'm going to set up shop somewhere else. If I'm going to be away from my home for, what's it going to be, at least 5 years, it might be 10 years, is my wife going to be married to someone else when I get back? Is she still going to be alive? She might have dropped dead from a disease. What is going through the minds of the men in his army? Do they see themselves as soldiers in the Roman sense? No, they know that they are mercenaries. The man leading them, do they see him as a general? He's often referred to as a general, but you could say, well, he's an adventurer, or he is himself a mercenary because he's living off loot. We have an idea of the general today as someone who is given his legitimacy by the state. If you're an American general, you're given all these expensive tanks and helicopters and so forth to play with that have been paid for by taxpayers' money, and so the government has to give you the authority to do that, and it's the government who gives you your command and gives you your orders, and you are fighting for the government's aims. That's how we conceive of war today. But that wasn't this war. This was the Barkids having a go. Right, what can we get for ourselves? What can we conquer? How many allies can we make? How much loot can we get? How rich can we get? And maybe how much revenge can we get? But I would play down. It is often thought that Hannibal was motivated by revenge, wanting to avenge his father and avenge the First Punic War. I don't entirely buy that, though it may be a factor. The famous story of his, some of you might know the famous story when he was 9 years old, that he was supposedly took part in a ritual with blood sacrifice, and his father made him swear that he would never be a friend of the Romans. I can see a couple of you nodding. Did that actually happen? It's a story that was in circulation. And
the Romans, right?
Well, yes, and you write your picture that you want your people to believe of the enemy you're up against. Oh, he was evil. He was always going to be against us. We never could have signed a peace with him because he never would have accepted it. He would have fought on regardless. If you chopped his leg off, he would have hopped off. Oh, that's only a flesh wound. And was he a genius? Because he pulled off a string of astonishing victories against the Romans. So if he was actually just lucky, it doesn't make the Romans look good, does it? So how do you explain that the Romans, you're trying to write a history and explain to other Romans and the rest of the world that Rome's really great, and we got beaten again and again and again, sometimes annihilated by a ragtag motley load of polyglot peasants from all over the shop. You might think, well, that doesn't look good. But what if we say they were led by a genius? Then we don't look so bad. So maybe a lot of the contradictions in Roman history can be explained by that sort of thing. You write the version of your enemy that suits you. Roman historians, including Livy, if you want to read one book, read Livy's War with Hannibal. It's the most comprehensive and, I would say, entertaining version of the story. There are loads of little bits. Cornelius Nepos, Plutarch's Lives, he has history mixed in with his biographies of various people who were involved. Polybius, of course, a lot of people say, oh no, you should read Polybius. He was more contemporary and more accurate. But actually Livy was largely copying Polybius. And the trouble with Polybius is that after Cannae, we've just got a few fragments. It's a very incomplete picture we've got with Polybius. So yeah, if you read one book, read Livy. Sorry, that was a sidetrack. What sort of man was he? What was he actually like? Because I'm writing the script for a graphic novel, and so we have to draw what he looks like. And if you make him handsome, that's sort of saying something about him. History records that he was reasonably handsome. He was meant to have very arresting, powerful eyes, inspiring. He was meant to be slightly taller than the average. He was obviously very physically fit. He was known for instance, sleeping on the ground between the sentries and the main army. So he was ready for action, and he wasn't living a life of luxury. He wasn't a pampered. He was a soldier's soldier, and perhaps that's one of the reasons that so many people followed him so happily into war again and again, because they had faith in him. He was one of them in that sense. But there is a danger of making him too much the goody. You know, if you're, in my dramatized version of the Second Punic War, I don't want you just thinking, oh, come on, the Carthaginians, beat those nasty Romans. But the Romans writing about him, I can't see saying he was really cruel. And yet, they say almost nothing about him that suggests that he was. And again, there are accounts of him very honourably giving burial to the Romans that he had defeated, not slaughtering prisoners, freeing prisoners sometimes without a quibble, and even ransoming off Roman prisoners who were all expecting to die, and making gentle speeches to them, saying that I'm not actually here to kill everyone, I'm just here to force Rome to capitulate. And the instances of Roman cruelty in the same Roman histories are far greater and far more frequent and far more obvious. Whenever I read a Roman account saying how cruel Hannibal was, they always leap out at me as a bit of an odd thing. Okay, hang on, but why is he cruel? What are you saying is cruel? The only thing that I can see as cruel is that they were just so terrified of him. Hannibal at the gates in Italian is still a phrase used in southern Italy today. To express, everything's going wrong. Hannibal's at the gates. And literally Hannibal was at the gates of Rome at one point, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, battles. Obviously this is a 1 hour talk and I won't have time to go through them all, but the early ones are Battle of the Ticinus, which is where a character called Publius Cornelius Scipio first makes his entrance into history, saving the life, we are told, in one version of the story, of his father, who was called inconveniently Publius Cornelius Scipio. You think with 3 names you have a reasonable chance, wouldn't you, of being able to tell the difference between one person and another, but no. And later on there's another Publius Cornelius Scipio who plays another significant part in the war. At this point in Roman history, slightly over half the men in Rome are called either Marcus, Lucius, or Gaius. And as for the flipping Carthaginians, they were like the Greeks in that they just went by one name. Who wants to guess how many generals called Hasdrubal were there?
3 or 4.
3 or 4. Yeah. There were 11. And that's not the worst. Hanno. Everybody is called Hanno, and some of them are against Hannibal, and some of them are for, and some of them yes, they have ridiculously few names. The number of Magos, and yes, anyway. So but fortunately, if any of you get as confused as I have been, don't think yourself stupid, because history itself does not have enough evidence to untangle who a lot of these people are. So some of these guys, if the name Hasdrubal comes up, sometimes there is no historian in the world, no matter how expert, who can tell you which Hasdrubal it is that they're talking about. Anyway, so the Lion's Brood, you've got Hannibal, who is the oldest of the brothers, but Hannibal actually had a few older sisters. some of whom were a lot older than him, possibly by another wife of the father, by a different mother. And then you have Hasdrubal, the middle brother, and then you have Mago, the youngest brother, who was the dashing cavalryman who went hurtling about. Hasdrubal, for most of the war, is in Spain, and not with Hannibal, but Mago is for most of the war with his brother Hannibal, and both of those two die. Hasdrubal dies really horribly. Just to show how nice they are, the Romans behead him and then throw his severed head into Hannibal's camp. And they say that he's cruel, and at no point do they ever write of Hannibal doing anything as nasty as that. Mago, there are several versions of how he died. Possibly, we know that the main thing is that he died on the voyage to Africa at the end of the war, but exactly why, there are some versions where he was assassinated or killed by an escaped slave or poisoned, but maybe he just died of disease on the voyage. Anyway, so what was he like? Was he a nice guy? He was capable of very definite brutality, and he would do things that today would make us start. If he swears an oath, he gets a sheep, gets a stone, and smashes its brains in just to emphasize his point. If he does need someone to be killed, yep, he can do that apparently without compunction. I don't get the feeling that he was crueler than other men of his day, and he seems, if anything, more reasonable than the Romans he's up against. But I don't know that I'd invite him round to dinner. I don't know that he would have been a wonderful raconteur and friendly, jolly soul to have in the room. But there is this I think among wargamers, a lot of people want him to be the goody, partly because you want to reverse the way the battle goes. You want the Carthaginians to win because they were so brilliantly led, and it makes an interesting war game, and you can beat the Romans where he didn't. So there you go, I'm better than Hannibal. But what was his plan? I see lots of blank faces, and it could be that you're thinking, okay, great, at last I'm going to learn from this guy what Hannibal's plan actually was. Unfortunately, it's not in any of the history. We have to infer it. We know that he was trying to separate the allies of Rome. He was trying to separate the Samnites and the Capuans and various other people who'd been subjugated by Rome from Rome. And he had some success at that, but then some of them then started going back under the Roman fold, and that would have lowered the power of Rome. So I think that one possibility is that he was trying to free all of the subjugated states around Rome from Roman rule, set them up in a stable situation so that they could then in the future defend themselves from further Roman expansion, and thus limit Rome's power. Then perhaps get the Romans to sign a treaty, just as the Carthaginians had in the previous war, and then perhaps that's it, he would have been happy, he could have sailed home. Or possibly he was going to set up a Carthaginian colony in Italy, partly in order to keep an eye on Rome and to make sure that Rome had a constant thorn in its side. He did spend an awful lot of his life, as did almost all the men following him, in Italy. And as some people have pointed out to me, Italy's rather nice. You know, if you're from the deserts of North Africa, you might think, oh, actually, Italy's quite nice, quite like the wine, nice olive oil, I'll stay here. And a lot of the men perhaps would have met a woman. And this is one issue, a huge issue, which is not in any of the histories, and I've never even read a modern history book which deals with it. He arrives with 37,000 men. He allies a load of Gauls and takes them down to the other end of the country and keeps them there for ages. They're almost all men. If you march into an area that you're hoping to ally, you've got to say to your, let's say, 50,000 men, and no disrespecting the local ladies, okay? Because that's really not the great way to make allies. 50,000, an army of 50,000 mercenaries who haven't seen their wives for years and years and years arrive after a big battle, and you think no one's going to take advantage of any local woman? It strikes me as pretty unlikely. It's a huge logistical problem. He's trying to ally people marching into their territory, and if there are 10,000 rapes, which is perfectly feasible, how's that going to affect the negotiations for, hey, so do you want to ally me? Sorry about all the rape. How do you discipline tens of thousands of men to not do that sort of thing, to not steal? These are men who are on campaign hoping for loot. And if they think they can steal something now and maybe they won't get another opportunity to do it later, they're probably going to nick it. And it's just not in the history. But the idea that you can lead that number of men with almost no chance of seeing their families again. You can imagine 11 years into the campaign, you've been in Italy for 11 years, there's a conversation that's going to happen. Hannibal, at what point are you going to decide we've won and we can go home? And what is your end plan? Are we setting up a colony here? Are we ever going to try to take Rome? And unfortunately, it's not in the books, so I'm giving you a couple of ideas. Maybe he thought that he was going to plant a colony that was going to last. Maybe he thought he could force the Romans to a treaty. Maybe he thought if he hung on for long enough, eventually he'd get support from the Carthaginians, the Carthaginian Senate, and they'd send across a fleet and finish the job, and that's why he hung on for so long. How long did he spend in Italy? Anyone know?
Like 18 years? 10 years?
It was about whole years, about 15 years. The whole war was about 18 years, so someone said 18 there, yeah. But he was actually in Italy for something like 15 complete years, which is a staggering amount of time. So when a mercenary has been with you for 14 years, you've probably, the idea that we're going to walk home now has probably gone out of you probably let that idea go years ago, I imagine. The idea that you're going to see your wife again, you've probably got used to the idea that, no, I'm probably not. Even if she's still alive, and even if I'd spent 2 years walking all the way around the Mediterranean to get back, she's probably with someone else now. It was a problem that he had to come up with an answer for, and perhaps that is part of the answer. And it could be that he would say, right, everyone's fair game, but just stay away from the noble women, because they're the ones that matter, and it's the nobles we're going to be negotiating with, and what happens to the lower orders, don't tell them, I won't ask. Maybe. It's a horrible thought with a modern mindset, but that's not impossible either. But he freed all the Carthaginian slaves in his army. But then, and before you think, oh, so he's here to free the slaves, he's that sort of modern guy, he then said to all the Carthaginian slave owners, oh, but don't worry, I will compensate you. But then we never find out how he's going to do that, because again, if you go into an area hoping to ally and you enslave a load of them or steal their slaves in order to compensate the people whose slaves you've just taken, again, that's not going to put you in a great negotiating position. It's not going to you're not going to shine in diplomatic society that way. I'm guessing, and that's one other thing that I noticed in the history of the war, that there are towns like Capua, which was the second biggest town in Italy after Rome, that changed sides and for a while at least sided with the Carthaginians, but no ports. It took him absolutely ages to get a port, and he had to go to a huge amount of trouble. The port of Tarentum, which is right down in the south, it's just in, if you imagine there's the stiletto heel of Italy, it's just sort of there. He besieged that for absolutely ages and had a terrible time taking it. And in fact, for a long time, he just had a bit of it because the Romans were holding out in another fort immediately across a moat. And at one point, there were two harbours, one either side. He had managed to capture one of the harbours, but not the other one. The Romans clung on with their very nails to that. And it seems to me almost suspicious that none of the ports swapped sides, even though some of them, having swapped sides, could have then immediately got all sorts of wonderful trade with Carthage. So maybe behind the scenes the Romans are pouring resources, bribe money to the people running these coastal towns. Don't you change sides, because as long as we can isolate him inside Italy, he's stuck. And I see that the time is going by, so I better nip forward a bit. So he didn't get his ports, but he did inflict some spectacular victories. Ticinus was a minor victory. Trebia was a definite victory. Then we have Trasimene, which was, I imagine most of you know about Trasimene, Lake Trasimene. Yeah, it's not Trasimene. And it was an entire ambush. It was an ambush of an entire army using an entire other army. Possibly the only time that was ever pulled off in history. He did have the huge advantage of morning mists, but I suspect that he knew that there was a good chance that there would be morning mists actually when he was setting up the ambush. So I don't think that was entirely luck. He went scouting ahead personally, and we are told by Polybius that he disguised himself with a wig and was able to pass for a local, which is one of the many pieces of evidence to suggest that he wasn't of sub-Saharan African descent. There is this idea, that Hannibal was black, and unless there's been some spectacular discovery in the last few days, I can say with confidence that the amount of evidence of his being black is precisely zero. The Romans never described him as that, they never pictured him as that, and he is also described as quite distinct from the Numidians, although actually the Numidians are a North African tribe. They're like the Berbers or the Tuaregs. They're more Araby looking. Anyway, sorry, those of you who have watched my channel know that digression is a bit of my thing. So Hannibal ended up being confined for absolutely ages in southern Italy around the town of Brutium, and he got recalled by his senate to Carthage because someone called Scipio, who I think saw himself personally as chosen by the gods to be Hannibal's nemesis. He eventually, it took him years, persuaded the Roman Senate to let him go to Africa. He was saying that, let me take the fight to Africa. If we can land an army in Africa and threaten Carthage directly, then maybe that's the way to get rid of Hannibal. But the Romans had been content with just containing him there, whilst incidentally they fought a couple of other wars, because that's what Romans do, with some other people. Right, who knows who Fabius is? Fabian strategy, shall I talk a bit about that?
Yes.
Okay, but only a handful, right. So they lost in battle after battle after battle. After Trasimene, which was a catastrophic loss that threw them back onto their heels, and they had a religious experience almost. There was an earthquake that ravaged a lot of the Italian countryside supposedly on the day itself of the battle, and this was taken as a tremendous omen, and all sorts the usual things, two-headed goats being born and so forth, moss growing on the wrong side of a tree. They started looking at every holy book, looking at every possible religious explanation for this. Fabius came to power. He was actually elected at this point as a dictator, which that's what the Romans did. They would elect a dictator, and this had been done many, many times before, so it wasn't that unusual, but it was only in times of crisis that they elected a dictator, and it was expected that after he was given complete control of the army, he would then say, right, job done, and hand the army back, which they all did until Julius Caesar forgot. And Fabius decided that he was going to do something different. He said, look, every time we throw an army at this guy, he just beats us. So instead, we're just going to shadow him and just threaten him constantly and confine him to the inside of the land and to the inside of the country, away from the coast. And the more he ravages the countryside, the more all the locals are going to turn against him. And the longer we keep him doing this, the more of his men are going to desert. His army, if we just keep going, it'll just wither and die. And he may well have been right, but he got recalled to Rome, and his master of horse, which was his second in command, Minucius, saw, oh great, I can now be the guy who beat Hannibal, and yeah, he lost. But at one point, Fabius had him trapped in a plain in the west of Italy, and that's when he made his famous escape using the cattle. It's too long to go into, but to cut a long story short, there was a pass being guarded by a load of Romans to make sure that he couldn't get out of the valley, and of course lots of other passes and so forth. He was surrounded. They got him, and he got a massive herd of stolen cattle and had his engineers tie burning brands to their horns, and he then drove them up the highland so it looked like an army on the march. And so the people who were guarding the pass thought, oh no, they're going to go over the top of us, so they then left the pass to go up to tackle what turned out to be a load of cows, and then the entire army marched in good order straight through the pass, thank you very much, and Hannibal escaped. Meanwhile, Fabius, who was on the next hill, was watching all this happen, but he was so completely convinced it's just a ruse, that's not the army, he's actually somewhere else, it's just a ruse, that he sat there immobile, and the entire army was able to march out of the plain. So that was the moment when Fabius almost had him, but then Fabius was for that failure and the next was ridiculed in the Senate and fell from grace, and his strategy wasn't pursued for much longer, and instead they went the other way, and they thought, right, okay, let's just put the biggest army ever in the field. Normally a consul would have a legion or two, and then you might have, say, 4 legions with the allies, and then maybe you get a double consular army, so that maybe you might get 4, even as many as 8, but they just thought, right, double everything and make them extra strength. Let's put 16 legions. It was exactly how many they had. Some historians say no, they had 18, but 2 were guarding the camp. And I don't want to get into all that, but it's something in the region of 16 legions, which they brought up to extra strong strength as well. So there were 16 extra big legions, and they just thought, right, he can't possibly beat this. We outnumber him, we out-everything him. And my suspicion is that one of the reasons they lost is, and I think Hannibal probably was deliberately making use of this, is that they had never commanded an army that big before. This was way over twice the size of any army any Roman officer had any experience. So the range of a trumpet doesn't do it anymore. The frontage was at least 3 miles. From one end to the other, you couldn't see the other end of the army. A flag wouldn't work. You could send a rider, but by the time he got there, he's probably forgotten what you asked him. So the command and control problems of having such a vast army perhaps was what made the Romans form them into one just dirty great big lump and send them forward with an advance and engage the enemy. On top of that, that's actually how Romans fought a lot of the time. Form up in the usual block, advance and engage the enemy. Our troops are better than their troops, we'll probably win. Which against most opponents worked. And they were constantly on the lookout for a trap. Up to this point, Trasimene was entirely an ambush, and every other battle had involved an ambush at some point. So they're constantly watching, sending out scouts, and perhaps Hannibal was very happy for them to look. In my dramatized version of it, I have Hannibal saying something like, no, let them look, don't worry, I know we've got more horse, we could see off their scouts, but no, I want them looking for the ambush. The more they're looking for the ambush, the more they're not going to notice that the ambush is actually right in front of them. The ambush is my army. And to cut a long story short, he managed to envelop the Romans, and the Romans ended up just advancing into just a killing sack. And even though the Romans outnumbered him, he was able to surround them, and a staggeringly vast number of Romans were killed. It was the lowest estimates are around 47 to 50,000, and Polybius is normally considered to be one of the more reliable ones and less given to hyperbole. He says 70,000 Romans killed. On top of that, there were of course many captured. 80 senators were killed. And Mago collected their rings and took them to the Carthaginian Senate and scattered them on the floor of the Senate, saying, "Look what we've done." It's a dramatic moment, and he was there trying to get the Carthaginian Senate to support him. But even then, the Carthaginian Senate was thinking, well, to the degree that the dramatist in me thinks, well, maybe there are some deals being done behind the scene that the Romans don't want us to know about, so they didn't put them in the histories. But a huge amount of money could have changed hands to make sure that certain senators in the Carthaginian Senate voted certain ways so that Hannibal wasn't given support. And there were quite a lot of people in Carthage who wanted the Barcids to fail because they were really big, scary, powerful, rich guys with their own private army. Hasdrubal leaves Spain, tries to link up with Hannibal, and at this point the Romans really get it together. In the Battle of the Metaurus, Nero and Gracchus and various other Romans, they really get it together and they organize very, very rapid marches of very large numbers of troops. And tragically, on the morning of the battle, Hasdrubal himself rides out and has a look at the Carthaginians and sees some of the men are new, and he sees unit markings that he didn't recognize before, and men with rust on their shields and other signs that they've just made a long journey and haven't had time to spruce themselves up yet. And I get the impression from reading the sources that he realizes, oh, the game's up. They've managed to reinforce, and I'm probably going to lose, but I've come all this way. I've come over the Alps as well. This is the last roll of the dice. Oh well, here we go. And he loses and gets his head chopped off, as I said before. So Hannibal doesn't get his support, and he ends up being drawn back to North Africa, where he fights the Battle of Zama. And a professor of history in America, I forget his name for the moment now, he actually got in touch with me saying that he reckons that the Battle of Zama never happened. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea for a video. So I made a video about the Battle of Zama, in which I looked at the possibility that it never happened. But I came down on the side of, you can watch my video on this. Yeah, I won't go over it, but I come down on the side of, yeah, it probably did happen. I'll just give you one example. He says, for instance, there's no monument anywhere in North Africa for the Battle of Zama, and the Romans were always putting up monuments, so why didn't they? And to that I would say, well, surely if there wasn't a Battle of Zama and they wanted everyone to believe that there was, they would build a monument. It's a greater reason to build a monument rather than the other way around. So I felt his argument was back to front. And again, to cut a long story short, he makes a very good, puts up a very good fight at the Battle of Zama, and even though he's got not his usual troops, he's got a much inferior army, mostly of local troops, with some from the core of his troops from Italy, but this is a ragtag, bedraggled remnant of the army he started with, and he loses to his arch nemesis Hannibal, who then Scipio, who then. And he's one of the first Romans ever to get this honor. He gets the honor Africanus. He gets this name bestowed upon him for his victory, and he gets a huge triumph in Rome as a result. And he does some pretty nasty things. He has his ally's wife killed. Massinissa turned the battle. Massinissa was the guy who wanted to be king of Numidia, and for Roman support in this bid to become king of Numidia, he changed sides from the Carthaginian over to the Roman, and even in the Roman accounts of the battle, it's clear that without the Numidians, the Romans probably would have lost. So he was decisive in turning this into a Roman victory, but he was married to Hannibal's niece. So hang on, is that right? Yeah, his brother's daughter. Yeah, it was Hasdrubal's daughter, and it just comes across as just petty nastiness that Scipio insisted that she be taken as part of his triumph and executed in the forum in public. And
did she commit suicide rather than be taken?
Unfortunately, there are several versions of the story, but yes, threatened with that happening, she may have committed suicide, which is the way the opera has it. In fact, there are two operas about Sophonisba, and she's a tragic heroine who pops up again. But it was because she was going to be killed, so one way or the other, she ends up dead because of what Scipio wanted. But you're right. Yes, thank you for reminding me. And I'm sure I've made little slips like that along the way, because there are so many different versions. And frustratingly, Livy, if he has several versions, he has about 5 versions of the death of Marcellus, for instance, and he says some say this, some say that, some say the other, and at no point does he back any of them up with evidence or say which he thinks is true. So we just have to guess. And so there was the man. What was he like? He was a soldier. He was very well educated. He spoke fluent Greek. He had Greek tutors with him. He had historians with him. He wrote a history of the war, which is lost. His historians wrote versions of the history of the war, which are lost. Scipio wrote a version of the history of the war, which is lost. His son wrote a history of the war, which is lost. There are so many, which again, those of us who love conspiracies might say that there's something the Romans were trying to cover up here with getting rid of all these different versions of the of what happened. But even the ones that survive, I think, don't really testify to his cruelty. And I think that he probably was an extraordinarily good commander. Nobody gets that lucky that many times, that spectacularly. And the fact that he could keep a polyglot army expecting to be paid away from their families for 15 years in hostile territory, never get caught on the march. In a lot of lessons today about the Romans and what they were like, is how the Romans marched, and this is how it was Hannibal who taught the Romans how to march. They only had those formations with the scouts on the flanks and the lines and the baggage in amongst the line and all the rest stuff that those of you who are familiar with ancient warfare will know. That was after Trasimene. Trasimene was the ambush of just a fairly ragtag bunch of Romans marching along a lake. He taught them how to march, and he taught them how to deal with elephants. He taught them how to fight. In a lot of ways. He himself, according to legend, put himself as the third greatest general of history. He said, well, after Alexander the Great and Pyrrhus, I would say I'm third. But a lot of modern historians say he's better. What he achieved against the odds was greater. Alex was perhaps more inspirational, but he was also a bit bonkers. Why did he take on India? Why did he cross a massive desert that everyone told him was a stupid thing to do, and then he did it anyway and lost half his army doing it? But he just wanted to show that he could do it. Hannibal didn't do things for effect like that. He doesn't seem to be a man who was interested in self-glorification. He didn't go around naming cities. And how many Alexandrias are there? I've lost count, but there are an awful lot of cities called Alexandria because Alex was just naming them all after himself. There aren't loads of... well, there's Barcelona, I suppose, which is named after the Bar Kids, but other than that, I think that's your lot. And a lot of the stories about him, such as that meeting with Scipio in the court of Antiochus, and the oath, I'm in no position to say they didn't happen, but I take them with a huge pinch of salt. I think these are legends created after the fact to paint a picture of him that was convenient to the people who came later. But the sheer fact that the Romans at the time couldn't understand how he was keeping his army together. Mercenaries expect to be paid, and they probably expect contact with women reasonably often, and keeping them away from women for year after year after year is not gonna work. And yes, you could, I suppose, create army brothels out of slave girls. Maybe, and I imagine after 15 years, a lot of his army spoke Latin and could well have thought of settling down with a little farmhouse in southern Italy. Apologies for the rambling. To conclude then, why did he lose? It's not because he didn't try to take Rome. I don't think it was ever his plan to take Rome. Rome would have been an incredibly tough nut to crack. There were just so many people in it. It had very huge fortifications. He had no siege equipment. He had very little success with sieges. And besides, even after Cannae, there were still 2 Roman field armies out there. And if he just plonked himself in front of Rome, he would have thrown away his main advantage, which was his mobility. And they would have trapped him, and then he would have been the besieged, and it would have been all over. And I think he knew that. He had to, and immediately after Cannae, it's quite clear that he was very busy negotiating like crazy with all the potential allies. That was the time when he had to strike with the irons hot. Okay, everyone, you're on my side now, right? Because I can actually free you from Rome. And this isn't a war of conquest. He says in a number of speeches, of course he could have been lying, but he says in a number of recorded speeches that it's not a war of conquest. He's here to make war against Rome, and he's not against any of the allies of Rome, and would be happy to be allies of them himself. And so his game plan didn't quite work, and what beat him perhaps was just the sheer might of the Roman machine. The Romans had such a strong culture that it never seems to have occurred to them to surrender. Now, of course, it could be that the loads of people were in quite high up positions were proposing precisely that, but it didn't get into the history. But they were certainly panic-stricken. I mean, even in Livy, he talks about how they were going in for human sacrifice in the Forum, which he describes as a very un-Roman-like act. And the Carthaginians, who sometimes got accused of human sacrifice, there's no mention of their ever going in for it. The Romans got religiously panic-stricken. They were burying Vestal virgins alive. They were doing horrendous things, and clutching at straws, clutching at every omen. They sent out to the far east for the Mother Stone and had to bring it back to Rome, and it had to then be put into the hands of the greatest man in Rome. And who was that? Anyone know? What was the name of the man?
Scipio.
Publius Cornelius Scipio. But not Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. No, it was his nephew, a different Publius Cornelius Scipio. However, I strongly suspect that it was sort of meant to be the other guy, but the Romans were terrified of anyone becoming king-like and getting above themselves. And so they could always say, though the auspices clearly say that it should be, they mean his nephew. Yeah, because he was already getting a bit above himself. He'd been a victor in Spain, and he was seeing himself as a bit divinely touched. There's an anecdote, for instance, he goes into one town, and one of the officers with him remarks, "None of the dogs is barking." And supposedly he said, I'm here. Okay, so yeah, there's divine effect of calming dogs. But the Roman machine was able, for instance, after one military disaster, they raised 4 legions in one day in Rome. The ability to fall back on that ability to mobilize, it's staggering. And they were all, to some degree, trained troops. They may have been a bit green in that they hadn't fought with each other, but they all have been trained from the age of 17 in the basics of all how to follow all the orders, all the kit. They went a bit like the scouts. They went camping and the like in units. So they knew they were all trained soldiers, the Romans, and they put fresh army after fresh army in the field. And so it was just like cutting heads off the Hydra. Okay, right. I have actually used up the whole hour, but I believe we don't have to hurtle out here, so I'm available for questions now. Yes.
How firm are the numbers for Cannae? Actually 50 to 80,000 troops, or is there some quibbling that they might have increased the number just to make their loss?
You think it was to the Romans' advantage to exaggerate their loss?
Well, at both sides, to say, these many thousands over there, and treachery, and we had these huge numbers there, and that's why we got to rally to...
I would say they're firmer than most ancient figures, but you should always take... I mean, even Livy himself contradicts himself. At one point he says there were 47,500, and then later he says 50,000. So is he now just rounding up because it's quicker to write 50,000? And as I say, Polybius, who is normally considered to be more realistic and more conservative, actually put it at a higher number, and of the dead, that is. No, I would say that it's reasonably firm. The numbers and the names of the officers involved and their families would have known these things. They would have been a very, very famous bit of knowledge. So many people were there, so many people knew about it, so many people knew that. I mean, he killed about a third of the adult population of Rome. Everyone would have known someone. I don't think it's something that you could have covered up or exaggerated. We hear of women waiting by the gates of Rome for day after day after day, hoping that their son will limp through the doors, through the gates. And so everybody knew about this. And interestingly, Varro, who's often blamed for it, Varro was the man of low birth who'd come up through the political ranks and ended up being joint consul at Cannae, and sometimes people try to blame him, but the Romans didn't seem to. The Senate actually sent out a deputation to thank him for his work, and it's his co-consul Paulus who died, and possibly it was actually Paulus who was in command, because it's quite ambiguous. The Romans, they alternated command. It's actually quite ambiguous which one was in command. And a lot of Romans will say, "Oh, it was Varro. It was the upstart. He wasn't a patrician. He wasn't a real noble. That's why we lost." But possibly it was Paulus who was in command, which explains why Varro was thanked for his work and not blamed by anyone at the time, and B, why Paulus apparently commits suicide and that he stays back to be swamped even after being offered a horse. He's offered escape and says, "No, I'm going down with the ship." And if he felt responsible, and he would have perhaps felt responsible had he been his orders that had started the battle. There is just to finish this off. There's another, but my personal feeling is that they were probably both in command because it was such an enormous army. They probably say that it's too big for one guy to command. I'll do the left, you do the right.
Well, here's a quibble with this. The survivor, he is honored, he's thanked, and he goes on to live. Otherwise,
yep.
Where we have some Roman legions, a couple Roman legions that actually managed to cut their way through the Gauls and escape, they were decimated in the older sense of the word and sent to serve continuously in Sicily until the road was worse. Why would this guy who took off with the cavalry and survived be paid any kind of honor, and the soldiers that were that cracked their way out of the death cell be so blatantly downtrodden, beaten?
The Romans hated losing, and Are you sure they were decimated? I know they were sent to Sicily, that particular group of people.
What I've read is that they were decimated, that they had to pay the penalty for cowardice, for not staying and fighting and winning.
Okay, I don't remember that, but you could be right. Don't remember that particular detail. But they didn't like losing, and yes, for not fighting to the very last, they were branded as cowards and ended up in Sicily. But then both Marcellus and later Scipio made good use of them, and in fact got greater loyalty out of them, because those men wanted vengeance and they wanted to clear their name, so they were extra keen to fight, and people like Scipio knew that, and he stipulated he wanted specifically those men in his army when he went to fight Zama. So,
but I'm saying the difference. So one of the commanders who escaped with his butt intact, and the servicemen they frowned on, that they punished. That's a strange thing, because the Romans that I've read about had no problem with blaming defeat on the commanders, and
which is why I think they really didn't blame Varro.
In this case, they never served again. In fact, they did that to commanders that won, but they didn't like their politics. They said, "You'll never command again."
Or even won, but didn't win decisively enough. Yes,
yes.
There's no pleasing some people. The thing is that no one is an authority on this sort of stuff. You can read every piece of available evidence, and then you have to draw inferences. The Romans were crucifying people in vast. After Zama, the Romans rounded up a huge number of Roman deserters who'd been fighting for the Carthaginians. Who were they? And how did they get away with that? And what were they expecting their lives to be for the rest of... were they ever expecting to go home and see their families again? We are not told. Again and again we're told that the Romans didn't have a problem with deserters, and yet they clearly did. They're making loads and loads of strenuous efforts to prevent desertion. Well, why are you doing that if desertion is not a threat? They seem to be lying to themselves about the desertion. But and these deserters were mostly crucified. The Romans were a cruel bunch, and yet they keep calling him cruel. But he didn't put village. One. He killed some people in one town, but according to history. But mostly he wasn't going around the Italy murdering people. And it's more likely that, being an intelligent man, he had an idea that there was a road to a perfect peace. There's no point in getting peace if it doesn't last. And if you've just murdered people, that's not a way to create a lasting peace. You've got to set up a lot of people.
If you kill them all, it's peace.
Yes. All right. Yes, you're right. You're right. If you killed everybody in Italy, that would have been a perfect peace. Somebody else, maybe. Oh, yes, sir.
The 80 senators that were killed, were they on the battlefield, or was that...
Yes, it was at Cannae, yes. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. It's normally said there were 80 senators. There were actually 80 senators, not all of whom were serving as senators at that point. They were men who had been senators or were eligible to be senator. But there are plenty of other... The Roman men wore very, very little jewelry. There were actually... consumptive laws, consumery laws, what's the word? Sumptuary laws, but it comes from the same root as to consume, to stop people ostentatiously spending money. So just like in the medieval period, you were only allowed to wear ermine if you were a king, and certain other furs if you had a certain rank socially. Similarly, jewelry was very rationed. Even during this war, even to women, they weren't allowed to wear more than so many ounces of gold. And most Roman men didn't wear jewelry, but if you had a high rank, you might wear a ring. But even if you were a senator, it could only be a gold ring if you were of noble birth and a senator. So some senators had an iron ring instead. So the symbolism of those rings that may go scattered was particularly powerful for that reason.
Were they soldiers at the time, or they were senators, or what?
Yeah, the senators
they were in the ranks.
They would have been officers. Yes, they would have been serving as officers in the field. So they would have been armor, sword, the whole bit. They were fighting alongside the men. There was a question. Oh, yes, sir.
How did Hannibal return to Carthage?
Oh, by sea.
Which way? From the Adriatic? from the net?
Well, he boarded at Brutium.
He went from the Gulf up to Tarentum.
I've got a feeling he went pretty. Okay, I can't give you an absolutely confident, authoritative answer to that, but I got a feeling, going by memory, that he did pretty directly, just straight across the Mediterranean, rather than hugging the coast around Spain. Don't forget that
he came off the
Spanish
southern part of the boot.
Yeah, Brutium's right near the bottom. Yeah,
There's a reputation that he went through southern Italy, all the way near Cosenza and crossed over into Sicily. I'm not sure.
I don't believe he ever landed in Sicily, and going by the Spanish coast would have been pretty dangerous in those days because that was under Roman control, and they did have ships out there. So taking to the open sea are very unlikely to be intercepted. So my guess, but yeah, my tentative. Hello, yes.
Yeah, wasn't there like an armistice that allowed him, to be recalled, and this was all worked out? They were trying to work out a peace, and they allowed him to take his army back?
No, I don't believe so. I think if they could have caught him on the open sea and drowned him, they would have been very happy. You don't want to have to fight an army if you don't have to, and there's only one reason he was crossing that sea, and that was to fight. And he was easily the best, most experienced commander that the Carthaginians had. Yes.
Which version of events do you believe led to Hannibal's death?
In terms of belief, I really don't have great reason to believe one after that. There are so many versions of how he died. He was strangled. He killed himself with a dagger, threw himself onto a sword, out of a tower, poisoned in a ring, got a servant to kill him, was captured by the Romans and beaten to death. The one I'm putting in the book is Poison in the Ring, which is Cornelius Nepos is one, because I have him wearing the ring all the way through the book, and whenever things looking bad, I have him just handling this ring, and so possibly when people read the book for the second time, they go, "Oh, yeah, that's the ring. I get it." So that's the one I've gone with, but I don't believe there's anyone who can tell you with any reason.
On that pleasant note.
Okay, right.